Today we are going to talk about Visual Studio IDE and how it is different from the normal Visual Studio editor. So first of all, what is an IDE? An IDE stands for Integrated Development Environment, which is not just an editor but way more than it. What are the different IDEs available in the market? There are many, out of which Visual Studio and Eclipse are most popular. Now, coming back to the topic of what are the differences between the two versions, Visual Studio IDE and Visual Studio Code. As you can see, this is a long list of differences, but the main and the most important difference to consider is that Visual Studio is an integrated development environment known as an IDE, whereas Visual Studio Code is a code editor where a developer can easily edit their code. And due to this limited functionality in the Visual Studio Code in terms of the amount of development that you can do, it is comparatively faster. Its processing speed is faster. But Visual Studio is slower as it takes time to load all the heavy components which are required to build complex websites and applications using Visual Studio IDE. Visual Studio does have a free editor and it also comes with better versions of the IDE. There is the greatest facility of intelligence available in Visual Studio, wherein you are not worried about the syntax and the next part of the code, but the intelligence is not up to the mark in Visual Studio Code. So these are some basic differences which we can understand, and as we go through this demo, we'll also know how the look and feel of the two softwares are different and how to basically go to the actual product and download it and install it. So to download our two softwares, one is Visual Studio 2022 and the other one is Visual Studio Code. We will navigate to the site visualstudio.microsoft.com/downloads. One thing has to be very clear that both Visual Studio IDE and Visual Studio Code, they are both products from Microsoft. And as we discussed the differences between the two, Visual Studio is the most comprehensive IDE for .NET and C++ developers on Windows, and it has its own set of packaged tools and features in order to have software development in a full-fledged way. Whereas Visual Studio Code is a standalone source editor that can run all the types of operating system, Windows, Mac OS, and Linux. So, Visual Studio comes in three downloadable versions. One is community, other is professional, and enterprise. The three types basically differ in terms of the licensing based on usage. Community is a free download for students for open source contributors in order to learn and understand the IDE and contribute to the IDE development as well. Professional. This is basically a license given to small scale companies working with small teams and which are also making profits out of it. And hence they have to pay for a license and can use a free trial for some time. Similar is the case with enterprise. The only thing is it is a much larger scale application that is using Visual Studio IDE with large number of teams using it. Hence, there is a difference in the licensing pricing and other features. So this is all about Visual Studio IDE. The number that you see 2022 is the latest version of this IDE available. Earlier versions were something like Visual Studio 2014, 17, 19, and so on. So in the coming years, we can get Visual Studio 2024. But all these versions have different versions of language tools available. We will dive deep into those topics once we go through our complete training of .NET. For now, we will stick back to our topic that this word Visual Studio encompasses basically two types of software. One is an IDE and the other is a standalone code editor. And there is a central place to download both of them, which is visualstudio.microsoft.com/downloads. From here, you can see both these softwares are available on a single page. Visual Studio Code is available in a downloadable format for all the three types of operating system, Windows, Mac OS, and Linux, whereas Visual Studio IDE has support only for Windows, as you can see in the first download option, and it has only one version available, which is a pre-download version for Mac operating systems. So this is all about the basics understanding of what is Visual Studio. What is Visual Studio, because it is no longer limited to being an IDE, but Visual Studio now also comes as Visual Studio Code, and already accompanying with Visual Studio 2022. So that's it for now. In the second part of the video, we will go ahead and download Visual Studio IDE setup and install it on a Windows system. So stay tuned and keep watching.